everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams, and tonight we're going to continue with the book, The Big Sea by Langston Hughes. And I'm going to go through each one of the next 4 chapters after salvation. I'm going to try not to take too much time. But what I like to do with these chapters is to point out issues that Black people were going through back in the day and relate them to today, and also like to show elements of his life and of his autobiography that are reflected in the ways of white folks. So to begin, an example of Langston Hughes encountering racism and just kind of glossing over it, I'm going to read a section of The Mother of Degrassi where he used to go to a movie theater and then all of a sudden they put up a no colored folks. He just nonchalantly writes about it like it's nothing. He says, okay, I paid 50 cents a week with which I went to see Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin and Theda Bara on the screen. Also Pearl Wright in The Clutching Claw, until the theater, belonging to a lady named Miss Patty, put up a sign, no color admitted. Then I went to see road shows like The Firefly and The Pink Lady and Southern and Marlowe when they came to town, sitting up in the gallery of the Opera House all by myself, thrilled at the world across the footlights. So he just throws it in there. I used to go to the movie theater till all of a sudden they put up no color admitted, so then I went to go to something else. He just keeps it moving. You know, he doesn't say anything about it. However, later in the second section of the book, he goes back to talk about the word nigger. And while he's talking about the word nigger, he starts to get emotional and he starts to explain what's going on when you hear the word nigger. And he comes back to these instances that we're going to see throughout this book. He points back to them, and it kind of culminates into what the word nigger means when he hears that word. However, like right now, he just says, they said no colored allowed, and he just keeps it moving. And this is when he was a child. And then there's an element right after that where it relates to Roy Williams and home and the ways of white folks. And he's talking about his Uncle Nat. And my Uncle Nat, before he died, had taught him music long before I was born. I saw Nash Walker only once because he was off in the East with the great Williams and Walker show, since he was a partner of Bert Williams. But I often heard the local people speak of him, and I vaguely remember that he brought to Laurence the first phonograph I had ever seen when he came back ill to his mother at the end. See, right there. It says, when he came back ill to his mother at the end. That's an influence to Roy Williams traveling the world as a musician. And then when he's getting sick, he decides to come back home to his mother. And then his stream of consciousness, he talks about the phonograph that he used to listen to as a child when he was learning his instruments. And so back to the text. He gave a concert at my aunt's church on the phonograph. So he gave a concert at the church, playing records for the benefit of the church mortgage fund one night. I remember my mother said she had had dinner with Nash Walker and his mother while he was ill, and that they ate from plates with gold edging. Then Nash, George Walker as he was known in the theater, died, and there was a big funeral for him, and I got my hand slapped for pointing at the flowers because it was not polite for a child to point. So you can see, again, Langston Hughes doesn't put too much emotion in his descriptions of his uncle getting sick, coming back home to see his mother, giving concerts at the church. However, when you read Home and Roy Williams and you read his stream of consciousness, you see Langston Hughes throwing in that stream of consciousness what it must have felt like for him to be ill why he would come home to see his mother, what he was witnessing when he came home. Like when Roy Williams came home to his mother, he got that um, Afro-American vernacular, his mother talking to him in his own language. And then he has the stream of consciousness where he's talking about how he feels when he's giving the concerts at the churches, and then just what it feels like to be back home after being famous and abroad. And then eventually, well, Roy Williams is lynched at the end. And this particular story, he just dies. And then it's weird how Langston Hughes just remembers things in his childhood. I got my hand slapped for pointing at the flowers because it was not polite for a child to point. And then he talks about things that we relate to in the black community, which is related to people in general who don't have a lot of money. He moves from place to place to place. His mother married again, and the person she married worked odd jobs, steel mills, coal mines. And then Langston Hughes says, but now I had a little brother. His mother remarried, stepfather had another child. And then he worked at the stepfather worked at steel mills. And then Langston Hughes talks about going to school, and this is where he became a poet. When he started, he said he went to a school that was mixed with a lot of different races, and they used to have different political views, and when they couldn't agree on their political views, they would look to the black people as a middle person. They would, if one side couldn't get enough votes have influence in the school, and the other side couldn't have influence, then they would pick the Negroes in the middle, because Negroes, and I'm using the word Negroes because that's what's used here, but Negroes or black people back then weren't seen as one side or another, so they would just pick them in the middle. And then that's where he became. So my classmates, knowing that a poem had to have rhythm, elected me unanimously, thinking no doubt that I had some, being a Negro. So that was his first encounter, being pushed into being a poet because he was black. And then they have some plays and things like that where Langston Hughes embarrassed his mother. And then we go to Central High. Central High was very good chapter, and this is the chapter where he talks about having the teacher, where he says, we had some wise and very good teachers, Miss Roberts and Miss Weimer in English, Miss Chestnut, who was the daughter of the famous colored writer Charles W. Chestnut. So he knows who C.W. Chestnut is, and I mentioned him many times because we're going to read some of his books, particularly The Marrow of Tradition, which is about the race riot that happened in Wilmington, North Carolina. And then he talks about Carl Sandburg, which was one of his favorite writers. And when you read these books, you may want to look up some of these artists and some of these poets and some of these writers just to see, to get an influence of what Langston Hughes enjoyed to read, because these are real names and real characters that he's talking about. And he liked Paul Laurence Dunbar's poems without rhyme like Sandburg's. So Paul Laurence Dunbar is a very famous black poet in the past. Then he has some poems that he wrote here. I'm not going to read them. And then he talks about, again, being black in the mixed school. Then he talks about the Russian Revolution. He says he doesn't understand why he should be against communism, because as far as what he was hearing about communism, he doesn't see why he should be against it, because under communism, under the theory, you erase all differences between people, you erase segregation and distribute everything equally. So he read some of the literature that had to do with communism. And then let me see if I can read some of this. Okay, and this is just a perspective of how the other races were treated with respect to black people in the United States. From the students, I learned that Europe was not so far away, and that when Lenin took power in Russia, something happened in the slums of Woodlawn Avenue that the teachers couldn't tell us about, and that our principal didn't want us to know. From the students, I learned, too, that lots of painful words can be flung at people that aren't nigger. Kike was one, spick, and hunky others. But I soon realized that the kikes and the spicks and the hunkies, scorned though they might be by the pure Americans, all had it on the niggers in one thing. Summertime came and they could get jobs quickly. For even during the war, when help was badly needed, lots of employers would not hire Negroes. A colored boy had to search and search for a job. So this is just one example that he gives where, in comparison to the other races in the United States, black people always had it the worst. And this is straight from someone who lived during this period, someone who was very articulate in expressing what was going on during this time. Again, he doesn't give his feelings or what he felt about it. He just gives an observation. A colored boy had to search and search for a job, and then he goes on to talk about how he searched and found the job. And then, he talks about this is when he went to high school in Cleveland. And then the chapter that we want to get to that I really enjoyed was Abrupt Encounter. And this is where he meets up with his father again. And his father lives in Mexico. So his father came to pick him up. He didn't even realize Langston Hughes when he ran into him. Langston Hughes was supposed to meet his father. However, his mother had moved, and since they were moving, the place where Langston Hughes' father left a telegram got mixed up. So his father comments on that, and I want to just read that section. The hotel was on Central Avenue, a block and a half from the restaurant where my mother worked as a waitress. I began to walk down Central Avenue as fast as I could. When I was about 3 blocks above the hotel, I saw a little bronze man with a mustache coming rapidly up the street toward me. We looked at each other as we passed, then we turned and looked back. The man said, "Are you Langston?" I said, "Yes. Are you my father?" "Why weren't you at the train last night?" he asked. "We moved, and I didn't get your wire till this morning." "Just like niggers," he spat out. "Always moving. Are you ready to go?" Soon as I tell my mother goodbye. So his father moved to Mexico. And the reason why he moved out of the United States, as we have discussed in previous videos, is that once you leave the United States, you encounter countries, people who don't have the same discourse as the United States. They don't have the same history of slavery. There may have been slavery there, but it's not the same slavery as existed in the U.S. It's not the same Reconstruction. It's not the same segregation, not the same Jim Crow. And today it's not the same new Jim Crow. The U.S. has more black people in prison than anywhere on earth. They got more black and white people in prison than anywhere on earth. There's more black people in jail now than there were slaves during slavery. And as far as leaving the country and being treated better, we're going to read the slave narratives. Frederick Douglass left the United States and traveled in Europe and talked about how he was treated better in Europe. He was treated like a human being. Harriet Jacobs spends a stint in Europe. She's another slave with the slave narrative and talks how she was treated better. Langston Hughes, he goes on his travels and he extensively talks how he was treated better in I Wonder as I Wonder. Malcolm X talks about going overseas and being treated better overseas. And then you got all the artists like Josephine Baker and today even Tina Turner, all these artists, black artists, a lot of times they move out of the United States and they never come back because they're treated better in these other countries than they are in the US. And not to say that there's not racism in these other countries. There is racism. However, it is not as intense and it's not as embedded in their culture as it is in the United States because of the discourse. And Langston Hughes' father tells Langston Hughes over and over again, go ahead and get your education in Europe or even in the US. But when you get ready to do business, because his dad was all about business, he was like, you got to leave the US because there's nothing for black people in the US unless you want to be a Porter boy or a bellhop or something, and there's nothing there. So, but Langston Hughes does not get along with his father, and he doesn't say that his father is wrong in his assessment of how to make it in the world. He doesn't say that his father's wrong about going to Mexico and being able to make it outside the US. However, he does not agree with his father's views on black people and Mexicans. Like his father, he calls black people niggers and he calls Mexican greasers, and as they're traveling, he says, look at them, look at the niggers, look at the greasers. And Langston Hughes mentions the prejudice in Mexico about being Mexican, having Spanish ancestry, and being Indian. So I'm just going to read a little section right here about 3 women that worked in the ranch that his father owned in Mexico. In their youth, they were very lovely ladies to look at, and I vaguely remembered from my trip there as a child, and they still wore their shawls of black lace with dignity and grace. They were all 3 the color of parchment, a soft ivory yellow, the blood of Spain, overcast just a little by the blood of Mexico. For they were not Indians, and they were not revolutionists. They had adored the former dictator President Porfirio Diaz, and when they wanted to speak of someone as uncouth, they said muy indio, very Indian. And I traveled abroad, and I remember that I went to the Dominican Republic. When I was in the Dominican Republic and we were riding in a cab from the airport to the destination that we were going, the cab stopped in traffic and there was a guy selling equipment that goes with the cell phone. And I heard the cab driver talking to the guy negotiating pricing. He was like, ¿Cuánto es? And the guy gave him a price. And then the cab driver said, no soy indio todavía. And then he drove off a little bit. And then they renegotiated. He said, no soy indio todavía. And then like later, they renegotiated. And then they came up with the price. But when he said, no soy indio todavía, he said, I'm not an Indian, which meant that's a reference to back when the Spaniards were colonizing the Dominican Republic and South America. They would trade worthless things to the Indians at high prices. They would just, I don't know exactly what they would trade, but there were many times when they traded worthless things to get the gold and silver from the Indians, because the Indians had plenty gold and silver and they used it for just jewelry and stuff like that. And then the Spaniards wanted that gold and silver, so they would trade worthless things for that gold and silver. So it came like, the Indians were dumb, and the cab driver said, yo no soy indio todavía. And that's what this here, it's really close, muy indio, very Indian and someone is uncouth. So they don't have a very high, in the Dominican Republic at least, they don't have a high regard for Indians in their speech when they talk. However, if you ask them if they're black, a lot of them like to say soy indio. They like to say that they're Indians. You could look at some people that are very dark skinned, almost pure African looking in the Dominican Republic, and they'll tell you that they're Indians. And there's like little jokes and memes, if you want to look it up, that about Dominicans be like, and they'll show like a black Dominican saying, "You know, soy negro," like I ain't black, but they are. So just, but that's another video. But I'm going to get back to the text here. Um, So he talks about his father's business, and then he talks about his friends that he made in Mexico, and then here's some examples of his father speaking. My father said, "Be careful of pickpockets and thieves. Mexicans steal." You know, he just goes through and just talks about people, and then he generalizes and makes a statement. But he's actually looking out for Langston Hughes, because later in the story there's talk of bandits and the Zapatistas, and they're very dangerous, and his dad looks out for him, teaches Langston how to shoot, how to ride, and everything, so he doesn't get caught up in trouble right here. And here's another thing his dad said: "Never give an Indian anything. He doesn't appreciate it." You know, this was when Langston Hughes was sharing things with his friend Maximiliano. And his dad would tell him those things, but Langston Hughes wouldn't always listen. Like Langston Hughes has a love for working class people, poor people, and black people. And that's where he riffed with his father, because he didn't like those generalizations that his father made. And then finally, towards the end of this chapter, he says, you know, he hates his father because his father keeps telling him to hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. And one day he finally got sick, and then he was not getting better. And then he said, "The three middle-aged sisters came to see me and brought a gift of guava jelly. They asked what on earth could have happened to make me so ill. I must have had a great shock," they said, "because my eyes were a deep yellow. But I never told them or the doctors that I was sick because I hated my father." So here's just another example where Langston Hughes, you know, shows some of his feelings. He says he hated his father, and it just happened where he said, "We sat down to eat at the table. My father gulped his food quickly, looked across at me, and barked for no reason at all, 'Hurry up.'" You know, his dad, prior to that statement there, he's talking about his dad is always like, "Hurry up, do this, hurry up, do that, hurry up, do this," to him, to the help, and to every time he does business. And he said at this point, he looked at him for no reason at all, "Hurry up." Suddenly, my stomach began to turn over and over, and I could not swallow another mouthful. Waves of heat engulfed me, my eyes burned, my body shook, and he just got sick. And then he says, he's sick because he hated his father. And in September, he went back to Cleveland without seeing a bullfight. Now, on his way back home, I just want to read this chapter because this is another section. It's a very short chapter, but it's another example of where black people stood in the United States compared to other races. And in this case, it's Mexican. On the way back to Cleveland, an amusing thing happened. See, Langston Hughes looks at racism as amusing. You know, you either laugh about it or you cry. He finds humor in these situations. On the way back to Cleveland, an amusing thing happened. During the trip to the border, several American whites on the train mistook me for a Mexican, and some of them even spoke to me in Spanish, since I am of a copper-brown complexion with black hair that can be made quite slick and shiny if it has enough pomade on it, in the Mexican fashion. But I made no pretense of passing for a Mexican. or anything else, since there was no need for it, except in changing trains at San Antonio in Texas, where colored people had to use Jim Crow waiting rooms and could not purchase a Pullman berth. So you see that he said that he didn't have to pass for Mexican until he got to the Jim Crow waiting sections in the Pullman berth, which means that the Mexicans didn't fall under the Jim Crow segregation rule here. There I simply went in the main waiting room as any Mexican would do, and made my sleeping car reservations in Spanish. But that evening, crossing Texas, I was sitting alone at a small table in the diner when a white man came in and took the seat just across the table from mine. Surely I noticed him staring at me intently as if trying to puzzle out something. He stared at me a long time. Then suddenly, with a loud cry, the white man jumped up and shouted, "You're a nigger, ain't you?" and rushed out of the car as if pursued by a plague. I grinned. I had heard before that white Southerners never sat down to a table with a Negro, but I didn't know until then that we frightened them so badly. Something rather less amusing happened at St. Louis. The train pulled into the station on a blazing hot September afternoon. After a sticky, dusty trip, for there were no air-cooled coaches in those days, I had a short wait between trains. In the center of the station platform there was a newsstand and a soda fountain where cool drinks were being served. I went up to the counter and asked for an ice cream soda. The clerk said, "Are you a Mexican or a Negro?" I said, "Why?" "Because if you're a Mexican, I'll serve you," he said, "but if you're colored, I won't." "I'm colored," I replied. The clerk turned to wait on someone else. I knew I was home in the USA. See, and this can relate to home with Roy Williams. He comes home and somebody calls him a nigger and it burns. Like he immediately encounters racism when he gets back to the US, and then that's his welcome home. For many black people who leave the US, as soon as they come back into the US, they're welcomed with some sort of racism. I even went to Mexico with a group of Morehouse students, and when we came back, one of the girls started crying because as soon as she got back, she was finding herself being disrespected by the people who worked at the airport for absolutely no reason at all. And she's like, "See, it seemed like they're being racist because there was no reason for it." She's like, "See, now I know I'm back in the United States because I get this negative treatment everywhere I go in the US." And she was a very nice girl. There was no reason for it. She breaks down crying. Langston Hughes says, "I knew I was home in the USA." And you notice in this chapter that they will serve Mexicans. Mexicans didn't fall under the Jim Crow segregation. The Mexicans could get the ice cream soda if they said it, and the guy looked at the guy that sat at the table with Langston Hughes says, "You're a nigger, aren't you?" So when black people are telling you, if you're not black, and black people are telling you, we got it the worst in the US, we have it the worst in the US. Yes, we do. It's right here, Langston Hughes, living the life. I know that, yes, there is discrimination against other races, and a lot of it seems similar. However, black people have it worse than any other race in the US simply because we're black and the history that they have. They had us as slaves, they seen us as inferior, and the slaves here don't have a country of their own like Mexicans do, even though that's a conquered territory as well. However, Spain didn't treat their slaves and their territories with the same amount of racism and the same amount of white supremacy as established here in the U.S. And even the U.S. it's just blacks and Mexicans in jail. So the U.S. is just the worst, and black people have it worse than the Mexicans do, as you see in this chapter, because they just see us as the enemy. They see us as slaves. They just want to segregate and stay away from us, and we keep getting little rights, little inch, and then they want to take it back. However, we still have it the worst in the U.S. until you show me some proof of some other race that has it worse than we do. And then I'll show you some more proof that we have it worse in the U.S. So the following chapter is called I've Known Rivers, which is a chapter that covers when he writes his first poem that gains fame worldwide, and he just goes over why and how he wrote it. And he speaks, I just want to mention one thing that Langston Hughes, and it'll be a repetitive statement that he makes, that when he feels sad, that's when he writes his poems. When he's happy, he doesn't write anything. That's how he said it. When I feel sad, I can write. I can't write anything when I'm happy. So he has a lot of poems. So you know that even though he doesn't express it as much in this autobiography, his feelings, he feels sad, and then you see it when you read his poetry, when you read his stories. He has many stories. That's where he expresses his emotions, and that's how he gets by, because these things do bother him. And when we get into the second half of this book, when he starts to talk about the Harlem Renaissance, he does express when he's happy. He does express that a lot when he's happy, but sad feelings and hurt feelings and anger, he doesn't express it that much. He did express his anger at his dad. He said he hated his father. He did express his sadness when he didn't experience Jesus and he was forced to lie. So every now and then he expresses feelings, but for the most part he doesn't. But when you read his works that clearly relate to events in his life, he expresses those feelings and you can see them. So continue reading the Big Sea, read the next 4 chapters, and then when I come back, we'll go over this. And as I mentioned in the last video, the parts 1 through 3, that his grandmother was the last surviving widow of the John Brown raid. I'm going to come back with a video talking about the John Brown raid and the history of that, and giving you some details of that. And that's because one of the reasons why we're reading this is because they don't want to teach you this in school, because when they teach you these things in school, they're forced to give you the background of these events in American history that they just don't want you to know about. So much, they don't teach us so much that the teachers don't even know about it. And I see that a lot of black people mention the John Brown raid. Many people know about it because they like to say, well, not all white people are bad, like Langston Hughes said, and they like to refer to John Brown. So we're going to get the details of the John Brown raid in the next few days. Okay, this is Jason Williams, Black Literature, Black History. Have a nice evening.